quite sure. But this encounter, and there were Greek. So when Alexander's empire, was established, he left Greek colonies all the way to India. For instance, Afghanistan. You remember the Bamyan Buddhas being destroyed by the Taliban. The first statues we have of the Buddha was not represented in form for hundreds of years, but the first ones were produced by Greek colonies. So they were ethnically Afghani or Persian, we don't really know. But the artists were Greek. And there you have these, looks like Apollo, but it's actually the Buddha. So we had interactions way back when. And there were teachings that obviously filtered through. At least one of Chaucer's Canterbury Tales is a Jataka tale, that is a tale of the Buddha's previous lifetimes. Of course, Chaucer didn't know that and presented it just in the way that he did. That's fine. And even additionally, you used to hear as a kid, I'm so old fashioned, but remember Jumping Jehoshaphat? People used to say like that. I grew up in the Midwest. Jehoshaphat is a corruption of Bodhisattva. So these are teachings. There was always this kind of filtering through, if only because of the Silk Road and Marco Polo. I mean, we have such an amazing interaction between human beings on this planet going way, way, way back. There's much more that we don't know. I'm quite confident, now with this modern genetics, they've discovered that there's, people that were in the Amazon who are not related to the other Native Americans. Closest thing they have is some tribe that was in Taiwan. So there's just so much that we don't know. But the big, and then later, again, Alexander's capital was Alexandria in Egypt, named after him, obviously. The greatest library in the ancient world was the library in Alexandria, which unfortunately was completely destroyed and burned down later on. But we know that there were Buddhist monks at that library. So this is rather fascinating. It's not quite as far. And then additionally, you have the linguistic similarities. Sanskrit is an Indo-European language. And so, all our modern European languages have devolved from it. I mean, with other influences, certainly. But for instance, in Buddhism, what's the fundamental problem that we have? It's not actually reality. Reality, the Buddha said, is first thing you can say about it is that it's blissful and it's aware, but we don't see it that way. We see it as a threat to me or whatever, something that I need to complete myself. This is the state of avidya, ignorance. This is the fundamental fault, avidya. And all of Buddhism is simply to erode away and then eliminate avidya. But if you think about avidya, is like a cappello, atheistic, agnostic. That means without. And vidya is like video, seeing without seeing. And that's what ignorance is. We're acting in a state where we don't see things as they actually are. The teachings of the Buddha, were developed for 1,500 years in India. And basically the entire subcontinent was basically converted, but not without a war. I mean, it's really amazing. In fact, one of the greatest emperors of India, Ashoka, he was converted after a war. The war wasn't about converting people to Buddhism. It was his disgust at his own killing. It's said of Ashoka too, that when he was dying, he did all these tremendous things socially around India. There's still monuments that he built, these pillars that have teachings on them about being kind to each other and religious tolerance and all sorts of wonderful things. He built rest houses around the subcontinent. People had a place to stay when they were traveling, encouraging trade and encouraging, the intermingling of people. It said that when he died, he had gained tremendous merit. But at the same time, as human beings, we're this mix. We're this actually very very auspicious mix of just enough non-virtue, and just enough virtue that we're in a situation where we have the capacity to learn, we have the capacity to transform ourselves, we have the capacity to look into the nature of our mind, to discover our basic wholeness. But we have enough non-virtue, we have enough suffering, dissatisfaction, that we're motivated to do something about it. Whereas in less fortunate existences, such as animals, such as hungry ghosts, such as hellish realms, the suffering is so overwhelming. It's like when you have a pounding migraine, you can't really be reading the sutras. On the other end of the scale, if we have too much wonderful things going on, we just sort of coast. These are the higher sensual God realms. I mean, there's not enough dissatisfaction to want to do anything. I'll do it later. I'm having a great time right now. You're not going to be filling out your taxes when you're on vacation. So we have this mix. The development of Buddhism over 1,500 years in India led to this tremendous development of various methods. It said in one of our prayers this morning, the 84,000 different dharmas. So dharmas is this wonderful Sanskrit word where dharma with a small d basically means appearances or phenomenon. Everything in the scientific world is a dharma, you might say. But it's also used with a capital D. These are the sublime dharmas. These are the dharmas that are more in accord, that are actually manifestations of our true vast nature. Because it's vast, we can't see it in this sensual way. We're living on a lower kind of level of consciousness, you might say. The Buddha nature is beyond consciousness. So 1,500 years of development in India led to this tremendous display of 84,000 different practices. They all have the same thing at heart, this realization of the nature of our own mind. This is called the Tathagata Garbha, the womb of the Buddhas. The Buddhas are born out of this realization. And Buddha just simply means one who has awakened, no longer asleep. And yet the teachings are subtle. It's said that after his great accomplishment, the Buddha, can you imagine? He had like the wealth of Elon Musk and the political power he was going to be a king. He just had this incredibly privileged kind of situation, and he abandoned that. And I often think that we don't truly appreciate the greatness of that renunciation and how much it took in a societal way. I mean, in America, it's like, what was that movie, Love, Pray, Eat or something? Some woman who runs away from her family and is running all over the place, finds some boyfriend in Bali. We think this is cool. I'm just running around doing all this stuff. That's how we find ourselves, right? But in India, the concept of one of the meanings of dharma is duty. They still have the caste system going on in India. Don't let anyone tell you different. And he was a member of the warrior, the ruler caste. And so to reject all of that, it's more like us rejecting the idea that all people are equal. I mean, it's just like a fundamental duty on people, a fundamental belief. You have to have that. Otherwise, you're beyond the pale. We don't want to hear from you. You're not worthy of even your opinion or debate or anything like that. So that was the Buddha. He left that. And it's said traditionally, like on the night that his son was born, his heir. So it's an amazing kind of renunciation that he did. And again, getting away from, life of ease. And he pursued the greatest teachers of his day. He realized what they had realized. And each of them said, why don't you become my successor? You can take over all these students. He said, no, he had not come to the question that was eating him up. What is the cause of suffering? Now, even to ask that question shows that there's some sort of inherent occluded faith, confidence that there is an end to suffering. Even to think if it's just a possibility and maybe I'm wrong, maybe I'm totally deluded, you're still dealing with it. So he rejected that and he went to the other side. He thought, I'll just completely annihilate my ego and then wisdom will arise. And he embarked on the most ascetic path that anyone's done. I mean, unbelievable. Starving himself, sitting naked under waterfalls in the wintertime, all in this attempt to come to truth. He wanted so badly to understand. And he almost killed himself. He was doing a ritual bathing in the Narayana River, and he was so weak he almost drowned in the shallow waters. He dragged himself to the shore, and it said that one of the great gods of ancient India, in the appearance of a maiden from the local village, came with a bowl of kind of like gruel, like cream of wheat. And he had a memory as she was approaching. And that memory was of himself as a 13-year-old boy. His father, the king Suddhodana, had a plowing festival going on in the springtime. And the 13-year-old boy was watching these men sweating, plowing with the oxen and that, and the earth being overturned, earthworms cut in half, insects, and the seagulls coming and feeding on all of this. And he was just struck by the pervasive nature of suffering. And he was so struck by this that he wandered off from the festival, sat under a rose apple tree, and spontaneously, obviously had great merit, spontaneously entered into a natural samadhi. Samadhi in Sanskrit, sama means like even, and di is the seed syllable for Manjushri, the Buddha of wisdom. So a spontaneous state where we're not being distracted by our sensual arisings or our thoughts anymore. He naturally entered into this. His father, meanwhile, said, where's Gautama? Gautama, where did he go? Sends a servant, finds the boy underneath the tree, and wakes him from this trance, you might say, but not in this idea of a stupid trance. Well, he remembers this. He remembers this kind of peacefulness and this vastness and everything at that moment of the crisis on the bank of the river, having almost drowned. And it dawned on him that truth would be found in the middle way between the extremes of self-indulgence and the extreme of self-abnegation. So he took this food. His 5 ascetics who had been practicing with him, he was like their teacher, they saw him eat and they said, Gautama's given up. And they rejected him and they walked away. But suddenly his mind was clear. He knew what he had to do. He had a vision of a spot, basically almost 100 miles away in Bodh Gaya, where other Buddhas had come to enlightenment. And he walked there. And he got there, and here was his tree. He sat under the tree facing east. And he vowed, I'm not moving until I've attained Buddhahood. And that night he went through everything, lifetime after lifetime after lifetime, and was assaulted by the forces of Mara, the delusion, all sorts of things, power, offering him all sorts of dancing girls, it just means the power of our desires. And he transformed all of those things through his great compassion. At the end, Mara sent all sorts of horrible, kind of like beings and demons with throwing discuses and arrows and spears and just all sorts of stuff. And he gazed at them, and through the power that he had acquired in this purity, all those weapons turned to flowers, and there was this rain of flowers going on. And with that, Mara was defeated. He entered into his great meditation. And he sat through I can't remember, 3 or 4 parts of the night. And just before dawn, he looked up and there was Venus. And with the light of Venus struck his eye, was his full awakening. So it's this remarkable human accomplishment. He sat nearby the tree for 7 weeks, doing various things. In one, he spent 7 weeks, it said, gazing with gratitude at the tree. Now, if you can think about that, I do think it was Aristotle who said gratitude is the shortest lived human emotion. So just imagine that, 7 weeks of gratitude to the tree. At first he hesitated to teach because he knew what he had been through. He knew the subtleties of truth and how human beings are wont to screw up everything for, as the Buddhists would say, for fame and gain. That's what we do. We think that's the road to happiness. So it's very, very strong. But he was again visited by Indra, the Hindu god. Said, no, you have to You have to teach. There are people that you will benefit. And so he did. 42 years, 45 years, something like that. All sorts of difficulties, all sorts of experience. So this has come down to us. 1,500 years later, Buddhism had its full cultural flowering in India. At that point, the warlike Tibetans didn't have a written language, had conquered the capital of China, these fierce Central Asian warrior society. You can still see it. We have a friend right now who's in Nepal, and there are traditions, Buddhist traditions in Nepal that have the same lineage as Buddhist traditions in Tibet. And they have the sacred dances that they do in some of these great meditation retreats. But in the Indian, the Nepali dance, it's this beautiful, flowing, feminine, kind of incredible, so graceful and beautiful, you want to cry. The same dance, the same tradition in Tibet is this warrior stomp. So there are cultural differences. But nonetheless, the Tibetans did something maybe unheard of in human history. They decided from the king on down, the emperor said, okay, we're going to be Buddhist now. And they sent their best and brightest over the Himalayas to, no faxes, no phones, to India for a period of several centuries in which they absorbed the full range of Buddhist teachings and transmitted it back to Tibet. Now, obviously, all of it didn't make it, but it's complete, it's full. So the advantage of this, it's not a sectarian thing. Buddhism went to China in a more serendipitous way. Monks that attached themselves to merchants, going around through Afghanistan, down the Silk Road into China. So the first book, printed book in the world, is the Diamond Sutra, translated from Sanskrit into Chinese by Kumarajiva. Good Sanskrit name, right? Good Indian boy? No, he was Khotanese, one of these Central Asian cultures that doesn't even exist anymore. But it was more serendipitous in that way, rather than a systemic translation and transmission of the full panoply of Buddhist teachings. Well, why is this important? Because if there's something that doesn't work for you in a certain way, there's something else you can do, which is still based on this fundamental belief, experience of Buddha nature. Because in the end, the Buddha really only taught two things. He taught wisdom with a capital W, emptiness, all the different words for it, but this absolute vastness that nothing can be said of it, and cause and effect. So emptiness and cause and effect. Cause and effect is karma. And that's our situation. We are in a karmic situation. All the stuff we're experiencing, we have put into action. May have been triggered by somebody else, but they're not the cause. They're just the spark. We're the can of gasoline that blows up. So we live in this situation of cause and effect. And over here at the root is this wisdom. But how do we get there? Well, many, many, many methods. But even the framework is helpful, because to realize there's a ladder, I'm in a deep hole, but there's a ladder, already I'm feeling better, even though I'm still in the hole. So we have all this karma, cause and effect. This is produced by our afflictions, by our negative emotions. This in turn is produced by our dualistic idea of everything. Everything somehow is me and you. This is generates the afflictions, which then we act on them through our body, speech, and mind, create the karma, create our life. The dualism instead comes from this misunderstanding of our fundamental Buddha nature. So there are many, many teachings that have been developed over so many years, and this is very helpful. You know, you think of the complexity of the situation that we're in, you might say. We have these basic teachings that the Tibetans did, like a framework of the Indian teachings, which is, again, helpful for them to understand what the heck is going on. I mean, India and Tibet, my goodness, tremendous differences. But it starts with this great, like the Dalai Lama says, first do no harm. That's the basic thing. We do no harm. This is emerging from the swamp of samsara, the Tibetans say. But that leads to really very deep states and happiness. The afflictions are conquered, but the effect, the residue of the afflictions, how we've acted on them, is ignorance. It's said that it's like there's a wooden box, a sandalwood box, and in that box there's a handkerchief that's been soaked in perfume. When you eliminate the afflictions, you've taken that soaked handkerchief out of the box, but there's still a scent that lingers. That scent is our obscurations of knowledge, in Sanskrit, jnana avatars. And so it's still there. So we still have to work on that too. So we have this do no harm leading to state, a wonderful state, but it's still individual. We still think of ourselves as apart from everyone else. But that leads to this state of the Mahayana, the vast loving kindness and compassion, recognizing all beings as having been your mother in a previous lifetime, working for their liberation before your own. I mean, it's truly transcendent, but living again, especially in this dualistic world as it appears to us. But now, instead of the do no harm, of abandoning all of the afflictions, now we're using the affliction of love and desire. We're in this realm of desire. We're going to use it skillfully, using the energy of our own desire to sort of transcend the power that desire has over us. But then there's another step, which is the unconventional Mahayana, which is called the Mantra Yana, the Tantra Yana, the Vajrayana, all these different terms. This is what's been especially preserved in Tibet. It's also in China, also in Japan. Some of these traditions made it there, not all of the Vajrayana traditions. Now, why is that significant? Because the Tibetans believe that in our particular time, the merit is less. The effectiveness, so to speak. I mean, there were people in the Buddha's time, like his 5 ascetics who rejected him. When he after his great awakening, he said he knew they were in Sarnath, Varanasi, again, like 100 miles away, and he went there to teach them. And when they saw him enter the area where they were, you have to stand up for a teacher, but they were so thought that he had abandoned the spiritual path that they wouldn't get up. And yet as he approached, there was something about him that was so compelling and impressive that they involuntarily stood up and said, basically, what's happened to you, Gautama? And he said, you can't call me that anymore because I've attained Buddhahood. And then they sat down and meditated together. Then he gave his first teaching on the Four Noble Truths, and they came to enlightenment sitting there. Well, those times are not our times. And the Tibetans say we live in a time when the afflictive emotions are especially rough. They've always been there, but they're especially rough right now. And on top of it, we're turned upside down. We generally, as a society and as individuals, we see non-virtue as somehow being virtuous, and we see non-virtue as and virtue as sort of being non-virtuous, upside down. So the tantric teachings are the teachings that give liberation by sight, by sound, by smell, by touch, by taste. We can use what we're experiencing right now in a transcendent manner, right here, right now. So for instance, in Zen Buddhism, the meditation mudra is left on top of right. Why? Because the right is skillful means, active. The left is wisdom. And we're human beings, so we're always sort of acting because we don't have wisdom. We're acting unskillfully, making bad karma. So we suppress our activity by do no harm with wisdom. Wisdom's on top. But in tantric practice, the right is on top. Why? Because we actually are Buddhas right now. We can use all of this. So the difference is one of, again, in the rest of the Buddhist world, it's the path of causation. We're practicing the causes that will arise as Buddhahood, that will arise as Bodhi, awakening. So we practice the causal path. But in the Tantra, since the Buddha said we all are Buddhas right now, we just don't know it. It's actually valid if you take that belief and conviction to practice the resultant path. Since I'm a Buddha, I can visualize myself as a Buddha right now. And what happens is that the benefits start flowing in that way. So it's valid, but at the same time, because we're using our perception, all of these otherwise limited kind of faculties, there are protections around it. You can't just go out there doing it. You have to have protections of promises, of vows, of seeking the Buddha for refuge, of understanding this. There have to be teachings, and there are secret teachings that are given, not passed out around, so to protect people from themselves. And yet this is the example we have, the great example of Tibet. So this is all very helpful but it can be overwhelming. So there's a wonderful modern practitioner, he's passed away now, the poet Gary Snyder. He was one of the characters in Jack Kerouac's book, Dharma Bums. He was the Dharma Bum. Jaffe Ryder, I think, was his name in the book. This too is how Buddhism's coming to the West. And he made the statement, which I thought was kind of interesting, when he came up against knowledge of Tibetan Buddhism when the Tibetans started coming over here in the 60s. And he said, Zen is like, you're trying to jump right into the depths of the ocean. And Tibetan Buddhism is like, yes, but at the same time, you're going up every little river, every tributary, you're investigating every cove, every little beach, you're just all over the place. It's just, essentially it's just completely full. And he said, but at the same time, Tibetan Buddhism, it appears to be like Mexican Catholicism on LSD. And I know that feeling, my wife and I, having practiced Western Zen Buddhism for, 15, 16 years, something like that. And then you, for whatever reasons or no reasons, you find yourself in a place like this and you see some Buddha who is a naked female with her hair on fire, with the head of a pig coming out of the side of her neck. And she's got a hook knife and a skull cup full of blood that she's drinking. And she's dancing on a demon. What the hell? This is like, what does that signify? And yet there's method in the madness. So the great teachings that come with this are extremely helpful because it allows you to communicate with other people, and it allows you to see the falsity or the limitations of our own attachments, beliefs, and therefore move past them. It's said, that when a pickpocket sees a saint, meets a saint, all he sees is pockets. We just filter everything through our natural attachments. And the great renunciation of the Buddha, how it affects in our lives, is an opening of the heart. Instead of trying to make reality fit through our preconceptions and everything we want it to do, instead you're opening it up to possibility. Buddhism is not blind faith. You're not just putting on a Tibetan shirt and that's all there is to it. You're not just joining a club. None of that. There's some meme going out on the Facebook now of the ocean. And here you have it's an underwater scene. And here underwater, there's a goldfish bowl, which of course is filled with water too. It's all underwater. And a fish swimming in it. And then there's another fish swimming without a bowl. And the one in the bowl is said to be religion, and the one without the bowl is said spirituality. Spirituality is religion too. Religion is what we're attached to. We like to believe that I'm free. Well, that's just a thought that binds you. The problem is so much deeper than memes, and yet it's the level that we, communicate with, unfortunately. So the Dharma is one that you have to penetrate. You have to go deeply into this. You can't just be satisfied with the statement of some politician or some sort of, I don't know what. We're in a very rough spot. Individually, societally, and that's not a political statement. The world itself, samsara. The Buddha saw this 2,600 years ago, and I'm just thinking, my God, if he could see it now. So it's very important what we're doing, but it liberates ourselves individually. How Can you have any kind of societal peace if you have individuals who are tormented? It just doesn't work that way. It can't work that way. This collective is all sorts of individuals. If you can't come to this understanding, if the peace doesn't start with yourself, so challenging. But the Dharma is this time-tested path. And it's not something, one of the great masters of Japan said, seeking refuge in the Buddha, our inherent awakening, in the Dharma, the expressions of this, the teachings, and the Sangha, people who are either realized or on the path to realization or who are questioning. Seeking refuge in those three, the three jewels, is not something that beings ordinarily do. But in the end, it's the final refuge of all. And that, of course, gives great peace and skillfulness to the practitioner from the get-go. It's like a mother. You know, the child is throwing a tantrum, but the mother's big experience knows this will pass. This is not an emergency, even though the kid thinks that, it's an atomic bomb is going off. So that vaster experience, similarly, we have, again, a lineage. It's extremely helpful. It's like you're in class and, you're in physics class, but there's this whole lineage of physics. You have faith in Einstein. You have faith before that in Newton. You're not rejecting Newton by believing in Einstein. All these things are developments. And yet we have all of that. So it can be overwhelming, like Gary Snyder said, when we talk about the 5 Buddha families. But the skillfulness of this is beyond anything, in my opinion. So it starts with this central Buddha of Akshobhya, wisdom. The first arising in the East is this Buddha family of Vajrasattva, transforming anger into sharp intelligence. There's something that's very sharp about anger, but that's our Vajrasattva nature kind of corrupted, grossified. But the sharpness there is Vajrasattva. In the South, there's Ratnasambhava, the holder of the jewels. Everything is richness and pride. How do we transform our pride? In the West is Amitabha, discriminating transcendent wisdom. This is the transformation of desire. And because we're in the realm of desire, where we see everything in that way, he's a special for us. And in the North, Amoghasiddhi, transforming jealousy. She's even green in color. The wisdom of this is something that you get a taste of, and then we proceed again with an open mind. We don't believe because someone told us that. The only purpose of the outer guru is to show you your inner guru. So all of this is there. I didn't get to what I was going to say today, but there it goes. Someone said once that, I'm Irish. So you got to some extent, the gift of gab, which is a blessing, and it's also a curse. So we'll stop there with that this morning, but maybe we'll pick up a month from now when it's my turn again. I'll save this. All right, first, any questions? Otherwise, we still have 5 minutes. We can stop. Kempo's here. We'll do some practice together. But any questions this morning? Comments, anybody?
I just want to say I'm new to this group, and thank you.
You're entirely welcome. Yeah, you're entirely welcome. In a sense, we're all new. I have to tell you that just speaking for myself, which is in my own narcissistic way, wasn't anything. I don't think there's anyone in this room who said, you know what, I'm interested in Buddhism itself. I'm interested in Tibetan Buddhism. I'm interested in the Kagyupta. I'm interested in the Drikung Kagyu. I'm interested in Garchen Rinpoche of the Drikung Kagyu. Nobody says that. And yet there's something that's really unseen and very positive that is in us that does manifest. And so you start to see even the tragedies in your life are revealing. Part of the thing I was going to read this morning is the spiritual journey of a very interesting man Paul Kingsnorth. He's a writer, and he started out the story of him growing up in England and doing some desecration in a local church. He would go into the visitor's book and say, "Hi, I'm Satan. I'm going to destroy you." Ha 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 ha. And he was like doing this over weeks and weeks and weeks. And then finally they took the book away. So they couldn't do it anymore. So that's how he started out. But in the end, he becomes Christian. And his story is very interesting because he had a little dabbling in Western Buddhism too. So I found it particularly. But what I really liked was his recognition of kind of like this vaster crisis that's going on and the necessity of these kinds of transcendent kind of teachings. So we'll do that again in the future, but thank you. Okay. All right. Let's take a break, tea, and we'll come back.